Lee Pace, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Oh, great to be here, Garrett. Heard you often and look forward to talking about Pinehurst.
So I'd like to start by talking about the founding of Pinehurst, just going right to the beginning. I've heard you say before, and I've seen you write before, that the appearance of a resort in this setting, in the Sandhills of North Carolina, was kind of a fluke. What do you mean by that?
Well, I do quite a number of after dinner talks in and around Pinehurst, and I like to start by saying, this is the accidental resort or the coincidental resort, depending on how you parse accident and coincident. But there is not one good reason for Pinehurst to be here, for it to exist. Absolutely none. You can parse it till doomsday and not come up with a good reason for it. It was just a series of coincidences of happenstance that made it all occur. Golf was not part of the original equation, dating back to the mid 1890s when James Tufts, who was from Boston, wanted to create a wintertime health resort for people like himself who were frail of health, and it was actually conceived as a sanitarium for consumptives. And golf was not a part of the equation. Truth is that Kiowa has more stake in being Pinehurst than Pinehurst does, because Kiowa was just down the coast from Charleston, where there is documented proof that golf clubs arrived in the Bay of Charleston in 1739, and there was a golf club in Charleston by 1786. Of course, they didn't exist, but a golf resort along the sea in the 1800s, you could understand, or if it was in an urban area, or if it was along a river, or if it had happened in Asheville, which was a summertime escape from all the heat in the South. You could understand that. But James Tufts happened to learn about 5,000 acres in this arid area of North Carolina that was not close to anything. And in fact, if you look at some of the photos in the Carolina Hotel of the early days of Pinehurst, it was but ugly. I mean, there was nothing attractive, no aesthetics at all. But this is where he decided to create a New England style village, imported the many of the plants, the grass, built the village, and it was only 2 years into it that when some of his guests started bringing their own golf clubs and balls and started hitting balls throughout the dairy fields and the peach orchards, that the idea for golf was originally conceived. So that's just one of the coincidences and one of the pieces of happenstance. And then, of course, Donald Ross's arrival was yet another one.
Who was James Walker Tufts?
He was a man who made his fortune in the apothecary business. He created the soda fountain syrups that spread throughout the eastern part of the United States and across the country. Back in the day when the apothecary shop and the drugstore were part and parcel of every town in America. And he was, as I mentioned, he was not in the best of health. And by his 60s, he was more into philanthropy and conceived the idea of a health resort far away from New England. At the time, Henry Flagler had not yet developed the east coast of Florida, so Florida was not a destination in the late 1800s. So North Carolina just happened to be about a day's train ride from New England, so that's one of the reasons that it was within reach.
So this resort was initially conceived as a health retreat. It evolved away from that, partly, presumably, because if you have a resort for people who are consumptives or who have tuberculosis, it might quickly become a kind of super spreader event once you sort of learn more about those diseases.
And I don't think he understood that when he originally conceived the idea. And so they had to make a pirouette of 180 degrees away from that. And Mr. Tufts lived in Boston, and which happened to be the city that Donald Ross immigrated to when he came to America in 1899. And that was another coincidence that Mr. Ross was in Dornoch, Scotland, working the golf shop at Dornoch Golf Club, when a Harvard professor named Robert Wilson got to meet him and know him and said something to the effect of, "Young man, if you ever should decide to come to America, look me up. There is opportunity for a young man who knows golf in this country because golf was in its infancy in the late 1800s. And Donald Ross did not come to America as a golf course architect. He came, there were not specialists in the golf business at the time. One person could be the club maker and the caddy master and the event organizer and the instructor and the greenkeeper and the agronomist. He did it all. And he learned those skills under old Tom Morris at St. Andrews doing an internship and brought his skills back to Dornoch where he was running the golf shop. And so Robert Wilson suggested there's opportunity in America. And Donald Ross was just one of many young Scottish golf professionals, golf agronomists, greenkeepers who came to America seeking a niche and an opportunity in a sport that was just starting to get some roots.
Could you say a little more about how golf came to Pinehurst? You mentioned this briefly earlier, but how golf arrived at the resort. It wasn't initially part of Pinehurst. And then what the earliest iterations of golf courses at Pinehurst looked like before Donald Ross arrived.
They were very crude. As I mentioned, some of the guests brought their own golf clubs and balls and started hitting them across the dairy fields. And James Tufts said, well, I wonder if there's some opportunity for golf. And he happened to pose that question to others in his circle. And one man in particular, the manager of the Holly Inn, his name was Alan Treadway, and the Holly Inn was the first hotel property in Pinehurst. It opened in 1895. Mr. Treadway said, no, golf's just a fad. Save your money. Don't waste it on golf. But fortunately, Mr. Tufts thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity. And he happened to know a physician in Southern Pines who played golf, who had been to St. Andrews, was not a golf course architect, but he knew more golf than anybody in the town did. So he asked this physician to help him lay out a golf course, and that's what became the first 9-hole and then 18-hole course that was laid out in 1898. And that was on ground that was to the south of the clubhouse as it exists today, and that is area where the Cradle golf course, the 9-hole appendage golf course that was built in 2017, is located now, and why it was called the Cradle, because it was routed on land on which the original 9 and then 18-hole course at Pinehurst was located. And I'm sure it was very crude. There was no grass on the greens. They used people call them sand greens, but that's really a bit of a misnomer. They were more clay than they were sand. They were a clay base with sand mixed in. They were flat. The hole was generally just in the middle of it. The teeing areas were built up. The caddy would actually take a little bit of sand, put some water on it, and build up a little artificial tee for a golfer to perch his ball on. And so they were very crude and very rudimentary, but it was no more than 2,000 yards for 9 holes, but that's where they first started to play golf.
So then Donald Ross arrives, and he's not yet the Donald Ross that we know now. This is early in his American career. What did Donald Ross do with the golf courses at Pinehurst, say just during the first couple of decades of the 20th century? Just a high-level summary, his overall kind of development of those first few courses at Pinehurst.
Well, there were 2 key elements to Donald Ross's arrival in Pinehurst in December of 1900. Number one is he found the sandy soil, which reminded him of Dornoch and was reminiscent of his home. If James Tufts had found at Pinehurst near where I live in the Triangle area of North Carolina, the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill area where we have red clay, I don't think the ground would have been as appealing to Mr. Ross. He may not have lasted. It may not have interested him, but he found the sandy soil that was very good for designing golf courses, for drainage. Here in Chapel Hill, we can have a heavy rain and it's waterlogged for a number of hours, but 60 minutes to the south in the Sandhills area, it's sandy and the water drains. And also, that area of North Carolina has a very rich Scottish heritage. Many natives of Scotland immigrated through Wilmington in the 1700s and the early 1800s. Just next door to Pinehurst is a town called Aberdeen. There is a county just south of Moore County called Scotland County. There are many roads in Pinehurst called McCaskill and McKenzie and McDonald and Dundee. So I think the sandy ground and the Scottish heritage probably made Mr. Ross feel very comfortable in the area. So he started designing golf holes in what he knew from Scotland, and starting with a place to put a green, and then building back from there. And so he rebuilt the number one course by 1901. He built 18 holes of number two by 1907. He built a third course in 1911, and then a fourth course in 1919. So those were the four core courses at Pinehurst Country Club that emanated from the main clubhouse. They all were built on sandy ground. They all had sand clay greens. The wiregrass, which is indigenous to Moore County and the Sandhills area of North Carolina, reminded him of the whins and the lovegrass of Pinehurst. So the golf that he built was what he knew from Scotland, and it was his American imitation of the courses he knew from Dornoch, from St. Andrews, from Carnoustie, and the other places in Scotland.
So zeroing in on the number two course, what did the initial iteration of that layout look like in 1907?
There are 11 holes still remaining on number two that are the same number and in the same general location as that original course in 1907. The first and second holes are still 1 and 2, and they're in the exact same spot, and 11 through 18 are the same numbers and are also in the same spots. Some of them have been lengthened some, but the greens, the pars, the configuration are pretty much the same as they were. Now, those first greens were flat. He did not build grass greens until 1934, 35, 36, when technology had evolved, and he and Frank Maples, who was the construction superintendent and the green superintendent, had developed ways to build Bermuda grass greens that could survive the winters. And remember, Pinehurst was a wintertime resort for the first 75 years of its existence. So they had to build a grass that was hardy enough to survive the winter and all the traffic that it was getting. And it took until the mid-30s before they could do that. But it is interesting that 11 of those holes are the exact same spot as they were. He added 2 more holes in 1935 and yet 2 more holes in 1923 and 1935. So in 1935, when he rebuilt the greens, built the green complexes that we know today, and added 2 more holes, then it became to the routing and the configuration that we know today.
Going back to that 1907 course, or even the course that maybe existed through the teens, what was the aesthetic character of the built features on this course? I've seen early pictures of Pinehurst where the courses look quite different than they do now, or than they did in the 30s and 40s. So am I right that number 2 looked quite a bit different in 1907 than what we're familiar with today?
Oh, absolutely. There was no drainage or there was no irrigation. So whatever grass grew was all watered by Mother Nature. It was not until the mid-30s when they redid the greens, or built the greens, I should say, and he built the final 2 holes, that they laid a single line irrigation system down the middle of each fairway. So it was not until the mid-30s that there was actually irrigation on the golf course. So the only parts of the course that were maintained were the tees, fairways, and greens. There was no ornamental flowers. There was no raking of the bunkers. It was all very haphazard. And part of this look was some of the look that they wanted to go back and retrieve when they did the Coeur Crenshaw restoration in 2010, 2011. But it was very unkempt. It was very natural looking. I've got to imagine it looked very much like Royal Dornoch looked at the time. We have seen early photographs and postcards from the early 1900s. And it just had a very raw, natural look. It reflected the sandhills of North Carolina. There was no lush Bermuda grass. There was just a lot of brown, a lot of sage, a lot of shades of tan, and there wasn't a whole lot of green color at the time.
So in the early years of the number two course, how did players receive it, especially high profile players? What did they say about the course? What was their assessment of it?
I think because of the length of it, I mean, it played close to 7,000 yards going back to when it first came to its final configuration in the mid 30s. I think the length was very stern, whereas the other Pinehurst courses were shorter and geared more toward the resort golfer or the club golfer. The Tufts family recognized in the early days that a way for them to get good publicity was to hold competitions that would draw golfers from across the United States. And that's what launched the North and South Championships that started in 1900. They had one for amateurs, which still exists and has been conducted every year since, 30 years now of the North and South Amateur. Has never been suspended during any of the wars. And then there was the North and South Open that was for professionals as well as amateurs that was conceived in 1900 and lasted for 50 years until 1951. And that's where the Sam Sneads, the Walter Hagens, Donald Ross was a professional, so he entered it. He won. So many of the good players, Tommy Armour, Walter Travers, Francis Ouimet, all of these players came to Pinehurst. They loved the golf course. They loved the strategy. They loved how there was an equal balance of left to right holes, right to left. There were short holes, long holes. You had to plan your shots around the bunkers. You could play run-up shots onto the greens. It was a total test. Ross believed that the long iron was the ultimate test of a good player. How well could you hit a 4 and 3 and 2 iron into a green, which is why he had many, at the time, very long par fours, like 440, 450-yard par fours. So it was a complete test, and it got a lot of good publicity, a lot of good reviews, and word spread across the country. And so it drew, as it does today, thousands of golfers who wanted to play this very challenging, difficult golf course.
Were there any particular holes at Pinehurst number 2 in this era of the course that stood out as the holes that people would talk about as the best holes on the course?
One of the things, Garrett, that has stood out about number 2 over the years is there doesn't seem to have been a consensus of signature holes.
That's why I ask. It's kind of funny that way. It's the way that we talk about Pinehurst number 2 now is as sort of a hole as opposed to a couple of representative holes.
The signature feature certainly is what are called the inverted saucer greens or the upside down walk shaped, which is the convex shape with the center elevated and the fall offs around the edges. The greens might be 7,000 yards in square footage, but maybe only 3,500 of them is the center part of the green that will actually hold a golf ball. So many of them you hit the edges. So it's the green complexes. And then in 1935, when Donald Ross built the green complexes as they exist today, he also, in addition to long irons, he also believed that chipping was one of the key tests of a good golf course and making recovery shots. He wanted the golfer to have choices to be able to putt from off the putting surface, to hit a bump and run, or if they wanted to hit a more elevated shot that would stop quickly, he would have those options. So he developed all these dips and swales and hollows around the golf course or around the greens where the ball would take off and run, and you would never know how far it might go. And so this has been one feature that is totally different from most U.S. Open courses that have heavy Bermuda rough. upright around the greens, that if you miss the green, you pull out a lob wedge and hack it out and try and get as much club on the ball as you can. Now you have choices as to, and that's part of the strategy, is to figure out what is the best shot for this particular hole. So to answer your question, no real signature holes, but there is certainly a signature feature.
Well, the greens have become the signature feature, but there is some doubt, is there not, about where this style of green came from. If you look at vintage photographs of Pinehurst number 2, the greens don't necessarily have so strongly as they do now that inverted saucer or turtleback character. They're a little bit more at grade. And so how did the Pinehurst number 2 greens evolve into the shapes that they still have today?
Pete Dye was stationed at Fort Bragg in World War II, and he came over and played Pinehurst. He liked to joke more than the good Lord should have allowed him to. He didn't actually see combat in the war, but he was at Fort Bragg, and one of his jobs was to drive his sergeant over to Pinehurst, and they played quite a bit of golf, and he remembers the shape and the levels of the greens, and up until his death, he was adamant that those greens grew in size because of top dressing over many, many years. Unfortunately, people who knew those greens back in the day, there aren't many of them left, so it's hard to say. But if you do look at photographs from the 1970s, from Golf World, from when the tour was through, there is that elevation to most of the greens, and the players of that era do talk about that. So some of this crowning of the greens grew organically when Richard Tufts, who was the grandson of founder James Tufts and was the president of the USGA in the mid-1950s, was a giant in golf administration. If the greens got away, they got away under his watch, so to speak. So Donald Ross was Richard Tufts' godfather, and they had a very close relationship. They were very close. I don't think Richard Tufts would have let anything happen to number 2 to get too far away from what he thought would have been Donald Ross's original intent.
Well, another subject when it comes to the greens is sand greens versus Bermuda grass greens. You've already sort of covered this, but I'm always curious, what was it like to play on the original sand, or as you put it, clay greens earlier in the course's life? What were those greens like, and how did people go about negotiating them?
I guess they were very much like going to a putt-putt golf course where you putt on a hard surface that doesn't have a lot of break or a lot of undulation. We have read written accounts and seen photographs of the caddies pulling. It's kind of a carpet-like structure. When their group would leave the green, they would sort of rake this carpet-like structure across the greens to smooth them out and smooth across any footprints. And then they would dust the clay surface with a layer of sand so that it would give the green a little bit of structure and a little bit of substance to it, and not make it as hard as putting directly on clay. So it was not as hard as cement, but very firm. And the layer of sand gave it a little bit of texture and slowed them down a little bit. I can't imagine that there was a lot of break to them. Of course, the stymie was used at the time, so you could knock your opponent's ball away from the green with your ball. So it was obviously a very different game that they played until the 1930s when Bermuda greens were installed, and that Bermuda, I have to imagine, was very slow. I mean, if you look at the putting styles, many putters had a little bit of loft on them back in the day because they needed a little bit of elevation to get the ball rolling. They were a very wristy stroke at the time, so the combination of the loft and the wristy stroke got the ball elevated and got it rolling. And it wasn't until our rabid thirst for fast greens has evolved over the last 30 or 40 years, that agronomic technology has evolved, and they're able to get just these incredibly fast greens. I imagine that the North and South Open in 1951 and the Ryder Cup in 1951 were played on very bumpy greens that might have rolled at a 7 or 8, and they are going to be picture perfect smooth and roll at a 11, 12, 13 next week at Pinehurst for the U.S. Open.
It's a very different game. You know, another thing about the sand green to Bermuda grass green transition is that it also brought the art of green contouring to the course, it sounds like, because from my understanding, the sand greens were fairly simple. They had to be fairly simple in terms of contour. But then when you start putting grass on putting surfaces, then you can get into more of this intentional contouring from an architect that we see in Pinehurst Green. So truly the greens that we're familiar with now really started their life in the mid 1930s when they were able to introduce grass onto the putting surfaces.
Absolutely. The green surfaces and the hollows and the swales and the undulations around them, those have all been there since 1935.
So, Lee, you were there to document Corin Crenshaw's restoration of Pinehurst No. 2 in, what was it, 2010, 2011, right around there?
It started in February of 2010. Some of the work was done while the course was open. They shut the course down in the fall of 2010 and reopened it in March of 2011. So it was essentially a 15, 16-month project of all hands on deck and a lot of work.
What was the biggest surprise for you in seeing how that project unfolded?
First, Garrett, it was just getting an understanding of what they were doing, how they were going to do it, the reasons for it. I'm very grateful to Ben and Bill for allowing me the access that they gave me while they were doing this work. It started in February 2010, and they started on the 11th hole. At the time, there wasn't a lot of understanding about what this project was all about. 2010, we were still coming out of the Great Recession. There were rumors that Pinehurst was having some financial difficulties, which it was not. They had closed the Manor Inn. They had laid some people off. They had reduced some staff. They had stepped back in a lot of regards, just like every business had 2009, 2010 because of the Great Recession. But they wanted to start as far away from the main clubhouse as they could with the work, just so as kind of keep it quiet for it to evolve. And the 11th hole, the tee of the 11th hole, is probably as far away from the clubhouse as any hole on the golf course. So I can remember this February morning when it was Bill Coore, Ben Crenshaw, and their chief lieutenant, a man named Toby Cobb, who was on the hole, and they were literally starting this process. And they stood back on the 11th tee, and they looked down the fairway, and Bill Coore looked down and he pointed at all of the strict delineations that he saw of organized grass, of different elements of the hole that you could see. You could see the woods on the right. You could see the hard pan sand. You could see the thick rough. You could see the intermediate cut of rough. You could see the fairways. You could see the first cut on the left side. You could see the thicker rough. Then you could see the hard pan. Then you could see the woods. He said, "This is too organized. This looks like somebody sat down and drew this up on a CAD. This is not," and a key element, Garrett, of the Bill Coore part of this restoration story was Bill knew the golf course intimately from having grown up in nearby Davidson County in the 1950s and 60s. And he could remember coming to Pinehurst on summer days with some friends, some hometown friends, and there was nobody playing in Pinehurst at the time because it was essentially closed in the summer. So for $1.50, they could get a ticket and they could play number 2 all day long. So he knew what it was like prior to the era of it being greened over. And so he said, this is not what made Pinehurst great, was all this structure and all this green. So he said, essentially, we're going to ugly the place up. We're going to make it look less aesthetically perfect. Um, he counted six different layers of grass heights, from the greens to the tees to the fairways to the various cuts of rough. And he said there should only be two cuts of grass on here: the greens and tees and the fairways. The rest of it, we're just going to let Mother Nature hold court. They then stripped out hundreds of acres of Bermuda rough, and they actually gave the Bermuda sod to parks and school systems in the area, and they just took it back to the native hardpan sand. They also found wiregrass from a variety of sources. Some of it they bought, some of it they imported from the countryside. And Bill spent a considerable amount of time talking to the construction staffs on the art of planting wiregrass in a haphazard fashion. That if you think about it, the organized parts of our brain want to plant seedlings or saplings in an organized fashion, in straight rows or in nice patterns. And I can remember he was there is a hillside facing the 10th tee of the back tee, which it stretches us out to 600 yards, and there's quite a slope. You go down a slope and up a slope to where you get to the main fairway. And he talked to the construction people about planting the wiregrass in a haphazard fashion along this slope so that it didn't look like it was planted by a machine or somebody who was thinking in an organized format. And it was the same thing with the edges of the fairways. They went in and they removed the triple row irrigation, went back to the single row irrigation that they knew had been there through the mid-1950s. And so they knew that the water would only be thrown roughly 30 to 35 yards to the left and right of that single row irrigation. So all of these steps went into putting the golf course back to where it was originally.
Something that strikes me about this restoration is how radical it was. I mean, truly, they went all out. And, Bill and Ben are so polite and such good diplomats that they don't necessarily come across as rabble-rousers. But
Right.
This was quite the statement to take the course back to this vintage look. I wonder if there was any shock for you when you first saw what this course was going to look like after Bill and Ben were done with it. Was there any shock for you? Oh my God, they're really going for this.
Not really any shock. Once I understood pretty quickly from those first couple of days what they were trying to do, why they were trying to do it, the tools they had at their disposal, and I realized this was a fascinating story to be able to watch this. But I knew that it would be shocking to the members, to the resort guests, to the general public, because who wants to make a golf course look less pretty? But what they were doing was taking it back to what made it so great and what had made it so natural back from the early days. And Pinehurst fell prey to many other golf courses of just this subliminal desire to make it look green. And Ben Crenshaw, I promise you, holds Augusta National in high reverence, having won the Masters there, and he still hosts the Champions Dinner. He reveres the place and the spirit and the traditions of the Masters. But he and Bill both will tell you that the Masters and Augusta, in a sense, do the game of golf a disservice, because the golf course is so perfect, it is so green, it is so manicured, and this one idyllic weekend every April, the entire golf world stops what it's doing. It sits and watches in reverence to this cathedral of golf in Augusta, Georgia, and they say, well, isn't this what golf is all about? This perfection, not realizing that this kind of green perfection is beyond the accessibility and the financial ability of most golf clubs and most resorts. And this demand for perfect green is just not realistic in the game of golf. That's why, and that's Pinehurst was as guilty as anybody else of, let's make this green and pretty. Let's be green and pretty. And Ben Crenshaw had a great comparison he liked to use with the fairways. They look like bowling alleys. They have become so straight, so edged, and the edges were so green, but they looked nothing like the old pictures of Pinehurst. So that's why they took them back and said, all right, it's not going to be as pretty, but we want to recapture what had been here many years before.
When you finally got to play the course after it was restored, what most impressed you about the renewed or refreshed playing experience there?
Number one was how firm it played. It was not as thick and lush as it had been, and there's kind of a distance is sort of a double-edged sword. I mean, if you hit it 30 yards more right down the middle of the fairway, that's great, but it'll also get you into trouble a little bit quicker. And so when you hit a ball off the fairway, before you knew exactly what kind of lie you were going to get, what kind of shot you were going to hit. Because, I mean, if you were on a tee and you pulled it a little bit in the rough, you could just, grab an 8-iron from the caddy and say, well, that's the best I can do is I'm just going to hack it out and hit it as far down the fairway as I can. Now, you've got 200 some odd yards of mystery waiting. Well, what kind of lie am I going to get? Am I going to get lucky, and am I going to be in a nice, clean area of hard pan sand? And particularly for the pros, hitting the ball off hard pan sand is not difficult at all. I mean, that's easy for them. They just compress the ball and pick it right up off the sand. Or am I going to be stymied by a tuft of wiregrass? Is my ball going to be sitting in a tuft of wiregrass, and I'm going to have to kind of catch it 3 inches off the ground? There's just all kind of variables to it. So that's number one. And then the width of the fairways was just much different. The fairways had gone from roughly 23 to 25 yards of width to now they were 35 to 40 yards wide. So you had some room that you could, if the pin was on the right side of a green, you could aim to the left side to get a little bit of a better angle, and vice versa. So you could work the angles a little bit better. And that so the combination of the taut fairways, the width, and the mystery of the wiregrass, those were the key things that were different about it right off the bat.
Something that really impresses me about the course as it is now is, yes, its width, the fairway width, but in the landing zones for drives, those fairways are often moving in really unexpected ways, like jogging one direction or another, or there's a tilt in the landing zone, like it tilts from right to left or left to right, so that although the course is wide, a lot of the drives are pretty difficult or demand that you kind of choose a line, right? And I would imagine that's something that the course got back with the restoration, because before that, a lot of those hole corridors had kind of straightened out, I guess.
They had straightened out and they had narrowed up, so that absolutely. What Donna Ross was so good about was working the angles and, going left to right, right to left, sometimes two directions on one hole. And so given that width, and add the taut fairways to it also. 2014 was a little drier than normal. We've had more of an average spring so far, so I don't think the course will play quite as firm as it did in 2015. But the width will certainly be different than the course was in 2005. So that's certainly an element of the presentation that will be fun to watch in next week.
So I'd like to pick out a couple of holes and maybe just discuss each in a little more depth.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe starting with the first hole, the opening hole. People are going to get familiar with it during the U.S. Open. It'll be the first challenge that players face. What are some of the features of the first hole that you think people should pay attention to?
Well, number one, you've got plenty of room to drive the ball. It's a wide fairway. The right side of the fairway is the best look at the green. The green represents so many in that it's set at an angle. It runs kind of from front right to back left. So it's not round. And right from the very start, you're going to find that if you do not land your ball on the crest of the center of the green, it's going to leak into a bunker front left, or it's going to go over in one of the hollows to the right. And if you miss it to the right, you're going to be faced with that decision, which is the ultimate decision for the good golfer. And one thing that Martin Keimer did so well in 2014 was he pretty much said at the beginning of the week, I'm going to putt from off the fairways or off the greens. And so he judged his speed, he judged his cadence of the putt, and he hit them just right going up those slopes and got the ball to die near the hole. So, but many other people just aren't comfortable with that, so they'll hit a 7-iron into the edge of the green there on the right of number one, hit it into the upslope, and then let it run out. So that first hole, you're going to get you're going to be hitting a short iron into the green, so it's not a particularly difficult hole. But then the second hole is a much longer hole. Although even though it was designed to be a drive and a long iron, the players today will hit driver 9-irons into the second hole.
4 and 5. These holes have a pretty interesting history. Maybe you could tell me, first of all, how did they get added to the routing of the course? Because they were, during Donald Ross's lifetime, I believe the latest addition to the course.
Correct. 4 and 5 used to be the first and 9th hole of what was the number 5 course, which was not a full 18-hole course at the time. It was really just a 9-hole course that was mostly restricted to employees. And some of the holes now are routed where Pinehurst number 7 is. And in fact, Reese Jones, when he was building number 7 in the 1980s, found some old abandoned bunkers that had been on these 9 holes and left them pretty much, they weren't intact, but he rebuilt them and made them a part of the number 7 course. But in any event, Mr. Ross built what is now the 4th hole and the 5th hole. The 4th hole was originally a par 4, and the 5th hole was originally a par 5. And that's how they were played in the late 40s and for the 1951 Ryder Cup. They were later flopped to the 4th hole becoming a par 5 and the 5th hole becoming a par 4. And that's how they were played for the 1999 U.S. Open. In 2005, I believe, they run parallel to each other. 4 goes out, 5 comes back, and the land to the far end of the 4th green and the 5th tee, that actually was where the original World Golf Hall of Fame was positioned when it was first opened in 1973. It's been since tore down, and now, of course, interesting, what goes around comes around, and the Hall of Fame has gone to Florida, and now it's come back to Pinehurst, but it's much closer to the resort clubhouse. But anyway, to get back to the iteration now, number 4 is long par 4, 5 is a short par 5. Mike Davis made the change going into the 2014 U.S. Open because he went back to the original design of it and felt that the green of the 5th hole was better designed to receive the short iron shot for a par 5 approach than it was to receive a long iron approach off of a hanging downhill right to left lie in the fairway of the 5th hole.
Yes, and if you look at the holes now, it seems pretty clear that the second shot on the fifth hole, now playing as a par five, is very interesting because you have that option to lay up or to go for it. It's not assumed that you're going to go for it. If it were a par four, then that would be the assumption. But once you start to look at the layup option, it is pretty interesting because you are trying to figure out with that layup exactly where to put yourself so that you can best approach that green with your short third shot. So I think it's become a more interesting hole. But in order to pull that off, they had to move the tee quite a bit back, right?
They did build a new tee, and in fact, if the Hall of Fame had still been there, they would not been able to have accessed that land where they did build a new tee. But you're right. That second shot is an interesting one because the fairway does cant severely from right to left, and you can play what you think is a safe shot up to the right, and it can catch that fairway, and with a firm fairway, you can roll down into a bunker or down into the waist area down to the left, and then you can have a very challenging shot coming off the hard pan sand or out of the bunker up the hill to a very difficult green.
Yeah, it's a great hole. Next hole I'd like to zero in on. I mean, we could go hole by hole and there would be something interesting to say about each one. But I suppose skipping to number 9, the par 3, what stands out to you about this hole?
The shallowness of the green, how wide it is, and how you have got to really nail the distance on it, number one. One of the great hole locations on the golf course is that far left location just over the bunker on the left where, if you don't take enough club, you're in the bunker. A stark uphill shot, not a lot of room to work with. If you've got too much, then you go over the green down toward the road that borders the course 7 neighborhood and the far edge of the number 2 course. So, one of the great things about number 2 is that it doesn't come back to the clubhouse, and so the number 9 green is as far away from the clubhouse as you can get, and it's on the edge of the property for the number 7 course. But that it's an absolutely gorgeous hole, and it really stood out as one of the holes that contrasted the most when you took before and after photos of before the restoration. Bill Corey used to call the bunkers tiddlywinks bunkers because they were just round and perfect in shape, and they put the bunkers back into and one of the resources I didn't mention earlier was that they were able to locate some aerial photography from the 1940s that showed the shape of the bunkers and the shape of the fairways, and so they were able to use those as reference points. So in my book, the Golden Age of Pinehurst, that chronicled this restoration and the evolution of the golf course, we've got several series of before and after pictures, and one of the best sets is of the 9th hole, and just how neat and organized and non-Pinehurst it looked before the restoration, and then how much it harkened back to the early days of Pinehurst. And there's a great photo of Donald Ross hitting a shot off the 9th hole to the green, and what Coore and Crenshaw I think did was very much in sympathy and in accuracy to what that hole looked like when Donald Ross played it many years ago.
Something else that's notable about number 9, as well as numbers 4 and 5, is the movement of the land on all 3 of those holes. It's a little bit more dramatic than a lot of the land that the course occupies. But I think part of what's so neat about Pinehurst's property is the variety that you find in the topography, because you get some of those more dramatic movements like you get on 4 and 5 and 9. Then you have some subtler land that's still kind of rolling and doing interesting things. Then you have a couple of holes that are flat. I think that people's impression when they see Pinehurst on TV is that it's mostly flat. But when you're there, that's really not the impression you get, right?
No, there's some interesting subtle movement of the ground there. One of my favorite features on the whole course is on the 10th hole, about 80 to 100 yards from the fairway is just a little dip in the
Yes.
fairway. I've asked people, why do you think it's there? And if you look at old maps, the the 10th hole, it used to be the seventh, and then later it was the eighth hole, and the green was much further up. It was not nearly as long as the hole. So I believe that little swale was in front of where the old green was before the 10th hole was stretched out and became a par five. You used to play what is now the 10th hole. Then you would veer off into, at one point there were two holes, at another point there were three holes that ran down an area where the number four course is. Then you came back and picked up on the 11th hole, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, 11 through 18 are in the same spot as they always have been. The 10th hole was always there, but it was different numbers, and it was a shorter hole at one point. So I've gotten away from your question. We got to talk about that little swale on the 10th hole, but that's just one of the neat little things of the golf course that it's gentle typography, but there is some interesting movement on there for sure.
I love that observation about 10 because I did notice that little contour right in basically the layup zone for the par 5 10th hole. And so it sounds like if the green were more up against that contour long ago, that it would have been more of a Valley of Sin type of situation right in front of the green. But now I think the way that it functions is so interesting because it's that swale is basically right where the safest layup is on the hole. You know, if you're playing a layup shot on your second shot on the 10th hole, then the best place to be if you're a conservative player is essentially right in the middle of that swale because there aren't really many other hazards super close to it. But because that swale is there, you got to start thinking, okay, am I okay with being down below? Or do I kind of want to be a little more short of it, but then my shot is a bit longer? Or do I want to try to get past it, but that's a little riskier? And so it just kind of messes with your head a little bit. And I've seen Corin Crenshaw do that on a lot of their par fives on their own original designs, where they put these funky little contours right in a layup zone just to give the player something else to think about.
And another of the topo features that are interesting are the ground elements is the 13th green, which sits up on the rise, and that's actually on an area that's an extension of the practice range, which was called Maniac Hill. So there's a reason for that hill to be there. If you walk to the right, if you walk off to the right and beyond the 13th green, you're essentially on the same level where the practice teeing area is, not the practice tee that's used for the U.S. Open, but for the resort and club. And it got its name from Maniac Hill just because of all the golf maniacs that used to beat balls off of it from back in the first part of the 1900s.
I love that, Maniac Hill. So getting toward the finish of the course. Now, I love the entire back nine at Pinehurst number 2, and something specific I love about it is how the routing kind of makes you feel as though you're getting lost in the property. It has this sort of wandering character. The holes are constantly changing direction. And by the time you get to the middle of the back nine, you're just not sure where you are in relation to where you started or where you're going. And there's this wonderful feeling of kind of pleasant confusion that overcomes you. David McClay Kidd calls this becoming bemused in the middle of a golf course. And you really get that sense as you're playing the back nine at Pinehurst. But getting to the end of the course, 16 through 18, such a great sequence of holes. What do you think is notable there in that 1, 2, 3 finish?
Well, let's make a 1, 2, 3, 4 finish and go back to 15, because 15 is just a bear of a par 3 with that green.
It's so hard.
The 15th green to me is the epitome of the inverted saucer green. It just sits perched up there. You're hitting a long iron into it. It's just very difficult to hold. And then 16, for us mere mortals, it's a great par five. I mean, I love it as a par five. It's always been a par four for the U.S. Open. Payne Stewart made a great long par saving putt there in the final round of the '99 Open. The 16th hole has the one water feature on the entire course, and it wasn't designed to be that way. It just the lake or the pond in front of the tee was originally just a depression that was not particularly attractive looking. So in the early days they just filled it up with water so it would look a little bit nicer. But that's the only, one of the greatest golf courses in the country, and water does not come into play at all for anybody unless you just cold top a tee shot there on the 16th hole. And 16, 17, and 18 run in three different directions. One goes west, 17 comes back in the opposite direction, and then 18 goes up the hill. So you've got a very long par four, you've got a medium length par three, and you've got a medium length par four up the hill. So you've got a lot of different lengths. You've got 16 goes a little right to left, 18 goes left to right, and 17 is a great short par four with a terrific bunker front right. Works much the same as the bunker on 9 does front left.
The 18th green, obviously an iconic location right next to the clubhouse. And I think people have or most golf fans at least, have a picture in their mind of what that whole setting looks like. I think something that maybe gets under discussed is the contouring of that green and how creative it is. Do you have a way of describing how that green is molded?
Essentially, there's just a little bit of sometimes they call it a river or a little undulation that runs through the green and separates it from back to front. And you either play to the back portion of the green or the front portion of the green. And the location for the final round of the U.S. Open generally is back right. That's where it was where Payne Stewart made his putt. So it's in keeping with all the greens on the golf course, is in that there are fall offs around the greens. You have to be able to read the subtleties of it, and the setting with what they have done at Pinehurst over the last 10 to 12 years. They built up a restaurant and a watering hole called the Deuce that is right behind the green. Used to there was it was a retail shop right behind the green, so there was no traffic, there was no nothing back there. They would occasionally wheel out a portable bar and open it up on the terrace behind the green. But 10, 12 years ago, I can't remember exactly when, they built the Deuce, which is what they call the bar and the restaurant there, and they've got a lot of seating there out on the bar. And so any afternoon, you've got 50 to 100 people out eating, drinking, and watching players come through on the 18th green. So no matter who you are, you have got a gallery on the 18th hole of number 2. And you can also, over to the members club to the right, you've got the resort guests on one side, you've got the members on the other side. So all of them are sort of sitting there, enjoying themselves, having a libation late in the day. And they will give you an applause, or they will give you raspberries if you chunk a chip from the back. So it adds an entirely new element to that playing number 18 of number 2.
Yeah, the people who were there on the day that I played the course a little while ago were pretty amused by my adventures on and around that green. So that is definitely a part of the challenge now. So Lee, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Lots of fascinating detail there. You are a prolific author, and I know you must have some things coming out around the 2024 U.S. Open at Pinehurst. So what should people look for from you?
Well, my most recent book, Garrett, thanks for asking, is called Good Walks. It is a book. I love to walk when I play golf, and Pinehurst number 2 is one of the ultimate walking golf courses. One thing I should mention is that years back, Pinehurst management, if you played number 2, you either had to take a caddy, which is a great experience, or if you drove a cart, you had to keep your carts to the extremities of the fairways. They still restrict carts They don't allow them on the fairways of number two, but now they allow you to walk and carry your own bag. They even allow you to take pull carts, which they used to not. So now, if you want to play number two or any of the courses at Pinehurst, you can go by any means of transportation you want, which is just the way the game is meant to be played. So anyway, I wrote a book about playing 18 of the great courses in the Carolinas that have walking cultures, that have a walking climate to them, that are walkable and have a great story. And we did a nice coffee table book with the University of North Carolina Press. So that's my latest book, and you can find it online anywhere.
Thank you so much, Lee.
Good. Enjoy the chat, Garrett. Look forward to seeing you in Pinehurst again soon.
Absolutely.